She whispered, "You never speak," until he said, "I love you." The kitchen smelled of rising dough and bitter disappointment. Clara Morrison stood at the wooden counter where her father had taught her to knead bread, her hands white with flour, her heart heavy as lead shot. 6 months married, and her husband Jacob sat at the table behind her, silent as a tombstone, carving arrows with the same methodical precision he brought to everything except conversation. The scrape of his knife against wood was the loudest sound in their marriage. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by today," Clara said, her voice brittle as autumn leaves. "Asked if you'd lost your tongue in the war, or if you were just too good to speak to common folk." Jacob's knife paused for a heartbeat, then resumed its steady rhythm. Clara waited, counting the scrapes like a condemned woman, counting her final breaths. 1, 2, 3, 2. Nothing. She said her husband came back from Apache territory talking a blue streak about everything he'd seen. Said most soldiers can't stop telling their stories, but you. Clara's voice cracked like ice on a winter pond. "You act like words might kill you." The October wind rattled the windows of the bakery they'd inherited from her father. Outside, Millbrooks settled into evening quiet, lamplights blooming yellow in windows where other couples shared their days in voices meant for each other. Clara envied them with a fierceness that scared her. She turned to face Jacob, flour dusting her dark hair like premature snow. He was a handsome man in his way, tall and lean, with hands that moved sure and gentle whether he was shaping wood or helping her lift heavy sacks of grain. His green eyes held depths she longed to explore, but he guarded them like a miser hoarding gold. "The women talk," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "They say you married me for the bakery, for a place to hide from whatever you're running from. They say I was such a pitiful spinster at 26 that I took the first man who'd have me, even a mute one." Jacob set down his knife with deliberate care. His eyes met hers across the small space that felt wide as the Rio Grande, and Clara saw something flicker there, pain, maybe, or regret, but still no words came. "Say something," she whispered. "Anything. Tell me you care about me. Tell me you hate me. Tell me why you won't speak. Just please, Jacob. I'm drowning in this silence." He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. For a moment, Clara thought he might cross to her, might take her in his arms and explain everything with kisses instead of words. Instead, he moved to the window, his broad shoulders blocking out the dying light. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. Clara frowned. Too late for customers, too urgent for a casual visit. Jacob went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to the gun belt he wore even in their kitchen. "Who is that?" Clara asked. Jacob's head tilted, listening to something she couldn't hear. His face had gone white as flour, and fear rolled off him in waves so thick Clara could taste it on her tongue. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped outside their door. Spurs jangled on the wooden porch, 2 men, maybe 3. Clara heard the low murmur of voices, the kind of talk men shared when they were planning something that required darkness to accomplish. "Jacob." Clara's voice came out small and scared. He turned from the window, and Clara saw something in his face that made her stomach drop like a stone down a well. Not just fear or recognition. Whoever waited outside, Jacob knew them, and their arrival meant nothing good. A knock came at the door, polite as death. "Morrison, open up. We know you're in there." The voice carried authority and menace in equal measure. Clara looked at Jacob, waiting for him to respond, to take charge, to be the husband she'd married even if he wouldn't be the companion she'd hoped for. Instead, Jacob grabbed her arm with sudden urgency, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. His eyes were wild, desperate, and when he opened his mouth, Clara held her breath, certain that finally, he would speak. The sound that came out was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken as if his voice was rusty from disuse. "Get down." Before Clara could process what he'd said, the first words he'd spoken to her in 6 months of marriage, the front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splinters. The oil lamp on the counter toppled, spilling fire across the wooden floor like liquid hell. Jacob threw himself over Clara, driving her to the ground behind the heavy oak table as gunfire erupted outside. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the kitchen, and Clara pressed her face against Jacob's chest, feeling his heart hammering like a war drum. "Stay down," he whispered against her ear, and his voice was rough as sandpaper, broken as a man who'd forgotten how to use it. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't let them know you're here." Through the chaos, Clara heard boots on the porch, the sound of men forcing their way through the shattered door. Light from the spreading fire danced across the walls like demons celebrating, and smoke began to fill the room with choking fingers. "We know you're in there, Morrison," came the voice again, closer now. "You can't run forever. What happened in Dakota, that's between you and us. But if you make this hard, if you involve innocent folks, we'll burn this whole town to find you." Clara felt Jacob's body go rigid above hers. In the firelight, she could see his face, and the man looking back at her wasn't the silent husband who carved arrows in their kitchen. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous, someone hunted, someone whose past had just caught up to him in the worst possible way. Another gunshot shattered what remained of their peaceful evening. Clara bit back a scream as wood splinters rained down on them like deadly snow. "Last chance, Morrison. Come out, or we start with the bakery and work our way through every building in this town until we flush you out." Jacob's green eyes met Clara's in the dancing firelight, and she saw something there that made her heart stop. Not just fear or regret, but love. Raw, desperate, unspoken love that he'd carried in silence for 6 months, locked away behind walls she'd never been able to scale. He cupped her face in his calloused palms, his thumb brushing away tears she didn't know she'd shed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and his voice broke on the words like a dam giving way. "For everything. For the silence. For bringing this to you. For—" A boot kicked through the kitchen door, and lamplight spilled across the barrel of a rifle pointed straight at their hiding place. Clara closed her eyes and waited for the world to end. But Jacob Morrison, if that was even his real name, had spent 6 months learning to love her in silence. Now he would learn to fight for her with words. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the crackle of flames and the thunder of Clara's heartbeat in the sudden quiet. Smoke hung thick as guilt in the air, and through the shattered window came the sound of retreating hoofbeats, not fleeing, but regrouping, like wolves circling wounded prey. Jacob's weight pressed against Clara's back, his breath warm against her neck as they lay hidden behind the overturned table. The kitchen that had been her sanctuary was now a battlefield, flour mixing with broken glass, rising dough forgotten in the chaos of violence. "Are they gone?" Clara whispered. Jacob lifted his head carefully, peering over the table's edge through the smoke. In the firelight, his face looked carved from stone, all sharp angles and shadows. He nodded once, then eased off her with movements careful as a man defusing dynamite. For now, his voice was still rusty, each word dragged up from some deep well of silence. "They'll be back. They always come back." Clara struggled to sit up, her hands shaking as she brushed glass from her hair. The fire had spread to the curtains, casting dancing shadows across the ruins of their quiet life. Jacob moved with sudden purpose, grabbing the water bucket from beside the stove and throwing its contents across the flames. Steam hissed like angry serpents, and the fire died with a reluctant sigh. In the sudden darkness, moonlight slanted through the broken window, painting everything in shades of silver and regret. Clara stared at the man she'd married, this stranger who'd lived in her house for 6 months, without ever letting her know who he really was. "Jacob Morrison," she said, tasting the name like something bitter. "Is that even your real name?" He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he'd retreated back into silence. Then he moved to the window, checking the street with the wariness of a hunted animal. "Jacob Crow Feather," he said finally. "My mother was Lakota. My father was a missionary who thought he could save her soul and ended up losing his own." A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "Morrison was the name I took when I ran. Seemed safer than carrying my father's guilt and my mother's blood." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. She'd grown up on stories of Indian wars, of settlers and soldiers, caught between worlds that wouldn't make peace. A half-breed name would be a burden in most towns, a target painted on a man's back. "The men who came tonight," she said. "They called you Morrison, too. They know both names." Jacob's shoulders sagged like a man bearing invisible weight. "They know everything about me. Where I've been, who I've loved, where I try to hide." He moved away from the window, and Clara saw him wince as he stepped wrong. In the moonlight, dark stains spread across his shirt. Blood, she realized with a chill. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." But his voice betrayed him, thin with pain and exhaustion. Clara rose on unsteady legs, her practical nature overriding fear and anger. "Sit down. Let me look at it." "Clara, sit down." Her voice carried the same authority she'd used with her father when he tried to work through pneumonia. "Whatever else you are, whoever you really are, you're bleeding in my kitchen." Jacob sank into a chair with obvious relief, his face pale in the moonlight. Clara lit the oil lamp that had somehow survived the violence, its flame casting warm circles of light in the darkness. She fetched her sewing basket and the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. The bullet had carved a furrow across Jacob's ribs, deep enough to bleed, but not deep enough to kill. Clara had tended worse wounds, her father's accidents, neighbors' mishaps, the inevitable injuries that came with frontier life. But she'd never worked on a man who flinched at every gentle touch, who watched her hands like she might hurt him worse than any bullet. "This will sting," she said, pouring whiskey over the wound. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he made no sound. Clara began cleaning the cut with steady hands, her movements automatic and sure. In the lamplight, she could see scars covering his chest and arms, old wounds, some from bullets, some from blades, all telling stories of a life lived on the edge of violence. "You're used to this," she said. "Being hurt, I mean." "More than I'd like." Clara reached for her needle and thread, then paused. Beside Jacob's elbow lay a small leather journal, its pages splayed open where it had fallen during the chaos. Her eyes caught on the careful script covering the page, words written in Jacob's precise hand. She moves through the kitchen like music made visible, the way she kneads bread, the way she hums while she works, the way morning light catches in her hair. I want to tell her these things, but the words stick in my throat like broken glass. Clara's breath caught. She looked at Jacob, who'd followed her gaze to the open journal. His face flushed dark in the lamplight. "Clara, don't." But she was already reaching for the book, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. Entry after entry in Jacob's careful script, observations and thoughts and feelings he'd never spoken aloud. Her name appeared again and again, surrounded by words of wonder and longing and something deeper than either. Day 47. Clara asked me about the war again. I wanted to tell her about Wounded Knee, about the children screaming, about the way Sarah looked when they know. I can't write that either. Some words are too heavy for paper, too dark for daylight. Better to stay silent and let her think me strange than to speak the truth and watch her look at me like I'm a monster. Sarah, Clara whispered. Who was Sarah? Jacob's face closed like a door slamming shut. For a moment, Clara thought he'd retreated back into silence. Then he spoke, his voice barely audible above the wind outside. My first wife. The words hit Clara like cold water. She'd suspected there had been someone else. What man reached 30 without loving at least once? But hearing it spoken aloud made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. What happened to her? Jacob was quiet for so long that Clara began stitching his wound, the needle moving in steady rhythm through his skin. Finally, as she tied off the thread, he spoke. I was a scout for the Army, 7th Cavalry, under Colonel Forsyth. We were supposed to be keeping peace between the settlers and the Lakota, but peace was never what the Army wanted. His voice carried the weight of old guilt, old grief. Sarah was a teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation. She believed in peace, in finding ways for our peoples to live together. Clara set down her needle, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. She was Lakota, too. Half like me. Her father was a trader. Her mother was Oglala Sioux. She spoke both languages, understood both worlds. That's why they killed her. The simple statement hung in the air like smoke from a snuff candle. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The men who came tonight, they killed your wife. Jacob nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. December 29th, 1890. Wounded Knee Creek. The Army said it was a battle, but battles have two sides shooting. This was something else. Clara had heard stories about Wounded Knee, whispered tales of soldiers and Indians, of a ghost dance that terrified white folks, of violence that erupted like prairie fire. But she'd never heard it from someone who was there, someone who carried the weight of witness in his silence. Sarah was trying to help the wounded when Captain Hayes shot her down, said she was giving aid to hostiles, that she was a traitor to her own kind. Jacob's voice broke like river ice. I saw him do it, Clara. Saw him put a bullet in the back of a woman who was holding a dying child. The journal trembled in Clara's hands as understanding dawned cold and terrible. The men tonight. One of them was this Captain Hayes. He knows I saw. Knows I can testify to what really happened if anyone ever asks the right questions. Jacob finally met her eyes, and Clara saw the depth of his fear, his rage, his hopeless love for a woman who died trying to heal the world. He's been hunting me for 3 years, Clara, following me from town to town, waiting for me to settle somewhere long enough that he can finish what he started. Clara looked down at the journal in her hands, at page after page of words Jacob had written but never spoken. Words about her smile, her kindness, the way she made their little house feel like home. Words about his fear that she'd leave him if she knew the truth, his certainty that he didn't deserve her love, his desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build something good from the ashes of his past. Day 112. Clara asked me again why I don't speak. The truth is, I'm afraid that if I start talking, I won't be able to stop. I'll tell her about Sarah, about Wounded Knee, about the nightmares that wake me every dawn. I'll tell her that I love her more than I loved my first wife, and that terrifies me because everyone I love dies. Better to stay silent and keep her safe than to speak the words that might damn us both. You love me, Clara said, the words barely a whisper. Jacob's hand covered hers, calloused and warm and gentle as always. More than breath, more than life. That's why I couldn't speak, Clara. Every word I don't say is a wall between you and the violence that follows me. Every silence is a prayer that maybe this time, maybe with you, I can keep someone safe. Outside, A coyote howled across the plains, lonely and wild and free. Clara looked at the man she'd married, this silent stranger who'd carried his love for her in ink instead of sound, who tried to protect her with distance instead of truth. The journal fell open to the last entry, written just that morning in Jacob's careful script. If they find me, if Hayes comes for me here, I'll have to choose. Stay and fight and risk Clara's life, or run and lose the only good thing I've found since Sarah died. I don't know which would hurt more, watching Clara die or watching her hate me for leaving. Maybe love isn't meant for men like me. Maybe some people are too broken for happiness. Clara closed the journal with trembling fingers. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of hoofbeats returning, and she knew their moment of peace was ending. But for the first time in 6 months, she understood the man she'd married. And she wasn't sure if that made everything better or infinitely worse. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, but Clara knew they'd return like winter storms, inevitable, destructive, impossible to escape. She sat beside Jacob in the lamplight, his journal heavy in her hands, feeling the weight of 3 years' worth of words he'd been too afraid to speak aloud. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "About Sarah." Jacob's face went still as pond water, but Clara saw the pain ripple beneath the surface. He rose carefully, favoring his bandaged ribs, and moved to the window again. Always watching, always listening, like a man who'd learned that safety was an illusion and peace was just the space between battles. "She was everything I'm not," he said finally. "Brave where I'm a coward, hopeful where I see only darkness. She believed people could change, that hatred could be healed with enough patience and love." Clara turned a page in the journal, her eyes catching on an entry dated 3 years past. Sarah would have loved Clara's bread. She always said food was a language everyone understood, that breaking bread together could heal wounds that words couldn't touch. But Sarah's been dead 3 years, and I'm sitting in another woman's kitchen, trying not to love her, because love is a luxury men like me can't afford. "You feel guilty," Clara said, "for loving me." Jacob's shoulders tensed. "Sarah died because she loved me. Because she chose to stand with a half-breed scout, instead of finding herself a safe white husband. If she'd married someone else, someone clean, she'd still be alive. You don't know that." "I know Captain Hayes." Jacob's voice carried bitter certainty. "I know he would have left her alone if she hadn't been married to me. He killed her to hurt me, Clara, to make me understand that men like me don't get to keep the things we love." Clara read deeper into the journal, finding entries that painted a picture of a woman caught between two worlds, Sarah Crow Feather, who taught white children and Lakota children side by side, who spoke of peace while the frontier burned around her. Sarah used to say that silence was just another kind of violence, that when good people stayed quiet, evil people got louder. She died trying to help wounded children, and I've spent 3 years proving her point by keeping my mouth shut about what Hayes did. Maybe she was right. Maybe my silence makes me as guilty as the men who pulled the triggers. She was a teacher, Clara said, piecing together the fragments of a life cut short. At the agency school, she taught reading and writing, arithmetic and geography. But more than that, she taught hope. Jacob's voice softened with memory. She had this idea that if children learned together, Indian and white, they'd grow up seeing each other as people instead of enemies. Clara could picture it, a one-room schoolhouse where languages mixed, where children who should have been enemies by birth learned to see past the color of skin and the shape of eyes. It was a beautiful dream, and Clara understood White had died with bullets at Wounded Knee. "What happened that day?" she asked. "At Wounded Knee." Jacob was quiet for so long that Clara thought he'd retreated back into silence. When he spoke, his voice was hollow as wind through empty houses. "We were sent to arrest Chief Bigfoot and his band. They were hungry, sick, trying to reach Pine Ridge, where they could surrender peacefully. Colonel Forsyth said it would be routine: disarm them, escort them to the agency, show them the futility of resistance. Clara found another entry, this one written in shaking script. I should have warned them, should have ridden ahead and told Bigfoot that Forsyth meant murder, not arrest. But I was a good soldier then, still believed the army fought for justice instead of land and gold. That belief died with Sarah, buried in the snow beside 300 Lakota men, women, and children. The disarmament went wrong, Jacob continued. Someone's rifle went off, accident or intention, I'll never know. But Forsyth used it as an excuse for what he'd planned all along. The soldiers opened fire on unarmed people, on families trying to surrender. Clara's hands trembled as she read the detailed account Jacob had written, his careful script recording horrors that newspapers would never print. Children shot down while running toward their mothers. Old men killed while raising their hands in surrender. Women gunned down while trying to shield their babies. Sarah ran toward the wounded. Jacob said, she was the only medical training for miles, and people were dying. I shouted for her to stay back, but she couldn't watch children bleed without trying to help. Captain Hayes saw her kneeling beside a wounded boy, pressing her apron against his chest to stop the bleeding. He walked up behind her, calm as Sunday morning, and put his pistol to the back of her head. Traitor, he said, just that one word, and then he pulled the trigger. She fell forward over the child she was trying to save, her blood mixing with his in the snow. Clara's vision blurred with tears she couldn't stop. She'd read about Wounded Knee in newspapers, sanitized accounts that spoke of military victory and the end of Indian resistance. But this was the truth behind the headlines, the murder of healers, the slaughter of children, the kind of evil that wore uniforms and called itself justice. You saw it all, she whispered. Every shot, every scream, every drop of blood. Jacob's voice was flat as winter prairie. And I did nothing. Stood there in my army blue and watched my wife die because I was too much of a coward to draw my gun on my own commanding officer. Clara looked up from the journal, seeing her husband clearly for the first time. Not a silent stranger, but a man carrying guilt too heavy for any human soul. A man who'd spent 3 years punishing himself for failing to prevent the unpreventable. What could you have done? One man against an entire regiment. I could have died with her. The words came out raw as open wounds. Could have drawn my gun and gone down fighting instead of living with the memory. Could have testified when the army held its investigation, told the truth about what Hayes did instead of keeping quiet to save my own skin. Clara read the final entries about Wounded Knee, Jacob's account of the aftermath, the mass grave, the cover-up, the way the army painted massacre as military triumph. She read about his decision to desert, to take his wife's body and bury her far from the killing ground, to disappear into the vast emptiness of the frontier. I buried Sarah beside a creek in Montana, where cottonwoods grow thick and the water runs clear. She always loved trees, said they were proof that beautiful things could grow from harsh ground. I carved her name on a smooth stone and promised I'd never love anyone enough to get them killed. That was 3 years ago. Now I'm breaking that promise every day I stay with Clara. You think loving me will get me killed, Clara said. Jacob finally turned from the window, his face etched with 3 years of sleepless nights. Hayes doesn't just hunt me, Clara. He hunts everyone I care about. It's not enough to kill me. He wants me to suffer first, to watch the people I love die because of my choices. So you chose silence. I chose protection. Every word I didn't speak was a wall between you and him. Every conversation we didn't have was one less reason for you to love me, one less hold he'd have over me when he finally came. Clara closed the journal, her heart breaking for this man who'd tried to love her from a distance, who'd carried his devotion in ink because speaking it aloud felt like signing her death warrant. But he came anyway. He always comes. Jacob moved away from the window, his movements careful and weary. I should never have stayed, never have married you. Should have kept drifting until he lost my trail or caught up to me. But you, his voice broke like river ice. You made this feel like home, Clara. For the first time since Sarah died, I wanted to stop running. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming rain. Clara thought about the life they'd built in 6 months of silence. Quiet dinners, shared work, small kindnesses that grew into something larger despite the wall of words between them. The journal, she said. You wrote to me instead of speaking to me. It was safer. Words on paper can't betray feelings, can't make promises I might not be able to keep. If Hayes killed me, if I had to run, you'd never know how much. He stopped, as if even now the words were too dangerous to speak. Clara opened the journal to the last entry, the one that had made her heart stop. Day 183. Clara deserves better than a ghost of a husband, better than a man who loves her in silence and fear. Tomorrow I'll tell her everything, about Sarah, about Hayes, about why I can't give her the words she needs to hear. And then I'll leave, because staying will get her killed, and leaving will only break her heart. Some choices aren't between good and evil. Sometimes they're between bad and worse, and love doesn't make them any easier. You were going to tell me, Clara said. Tonight, you were going to tell me everything and then leave. Jacob's silence was answer enough. Clara looked at this man she'd married, this broken soldier who tried to protect her with distance and ended up loving her from the shadows. She thought about the dance they'd never shared, the conversations that had died in his throat, the children they'd never discussed because he believed himself too damned for happiness. Well, she said, rising from her chair with deliberate calm, Hayes found you first, so now we don't have the luxury of your leaving. Jacob stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Clara, you don't understand. When he comes back, he'll find both of us waiting. Clara moved to the gun cabinet her father had built, her hand steady as she pulled out the rifle he'd taught her to use. You've spent 3 years running from this fight, Jacob. Maybe it's time to stop. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drifted through the broken window, closer now, deliberate as death. Clara checked the rifle's load with practiced ease, her father's daughter to the bone. Time to find out if love is worth fighting for, she said. The hoofbeats stopped outside the bakery, like a heartbeat ending. Clara stood by the shattered window, her father's rifle steady in her hands, while Jacob moved through the darkness with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent 3 years staying one step ahead of death. How many? Clara whispered. Jacob peered through the broken glass, his body tense as a coiled spring. 5. Maybe 6. Hayes always brings enough men to make sure the job gets done. The October night had turned cold, and Clara could see her breath misting in the lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, as if marking the end of their borrowed time. 6 months of marriage, 6 months of silence, and now it would all come down to the next few minutes. Jacob Crow Feather, came a voice from the darkness outside. Cultured, educated, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who wore his authority like expensive clothes. I know you're in there. We need to have a conversation. Jacob's face went white as flour in the moonlight. Clara had never heard that voice before, but she knew it instantly. Captain Hayes, the man who'd haunted her husband's dreams for 3 years, who'd killed his first wife for the crime of loving a half-breed scout. He sounds reasonable, Clara whispered. That's what makes him dangerous. Jacob's hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw. Hayes never shouts, never loses control. He kills people the way other men swat flies, calm, methodical, like he's doing them a favor. The voice came again, closer now. I've got a proposition for you, Crow Feather. One that might interest your new wife. Clara felt ice form in her veins. They knew about her, had probably been watching the town for days, learning the routines, the relationships, the weak points where pressure could be applied. Don't answer him, Jacob said urgently. Don't let him know you're alive. Men like Hayes, they feed on fear, on knowing they can hurt you through someone else. But Clara was already moving toward the door, her rifle held ready. He's going to hurt me either way. At least this way, I'll know what we're facing. Clara, no. She was already at the door, her voice carrying through the broken wood. I'm listening, Captain. Say your piece. A low chuckle drifted through the night air, and Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was a man who enjoyed his work, who took pleasure in the fear of others. Sensible woman. I like that. My name is Captain William Hayes, United States Army, retired. Your husband and I have some unfinished business from our time together at Wounded Knee. The massacre, Clara said flatly. Another chuckle, colder this time. That's what the newspapers called it. I prefer to think of it as pest control. Your husband witnessed certain events that day, events that some people might misinterpret if they came to light. Jacob appeared beside Clara, his face carved from granite. What do you want, Hayes? What I've always wanted, your silence. Permanent silence. The kind that comes with a pine box and 6 feet of Dakota earth. Clara felt Jacob go rigid beside her. Through the broken door, she could see shapes moving in the darkness, men with rifles, spreading out to surround the bakery. Hayes had come prepared for a siege. But I'm a reasonable man, Hayes continued. I understand that people form attachments, develop feelings for others. So I'm prepared to offer you a choice. I'm listening, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his body. Step outside, hands empty, and I'll make it quick. 1 bullet, clean and fast. Your wife can watch from a window. See that you died with dignity. Then my men and I will ride away, and Mrs. Morrison can go back to her quiet life of baking bread and keeping house. Clara's grip tightened on her rifle. And if he doesn't, then I'm afraid we'll have to burn you out. And in the confusion of the fire, accidents happen. Stray bullets find innocent victims. Your husband dies anyway, but slowly, and you die with him. The silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Clara could hear Jacob's breathing, shallow and quick, the sound of a man weighing impossible choices. She thought about the journal upstairs, filled with words of love he'd been too afraid to speak. 3 years of running, 3 years of silence, and it had all led to this moment. There's a third option, Clara said suddenly. Jacob stared at her. Clara, don't. You're afraid of him, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Afraid of what Jacob might say if anyone ever asks the right questions about Wounded Knee. That's why you've been hunting him for 3 years, instead of just letting him disappear. Hayes's laughter carried no warmth. Your wife is perceptive, Crow Feather. Yes, I'm afraid of his testimony. Dead men tell no tales, but live ones have an unfortunate habit of developing consciences. Then let's talk about what really scares you. Clara stepped closer to the door, ignoring Jacob's desperate grab for her arm. You're not just afraid of what Jacob saw. You're afraid of what other people will think when they find out Captain William Hayes murdered a woman who was trying to save children. The laughter stopped. You're afraid, Clara continued, her voice carrying across the dark street, that people will remember Sarah Crow Feather as a martyr instead of a traitor. That they'll ask why a decorated Army officer felt threatened by a schoolteacher with medical training. Clara, stop, Jacob whispered urgently. You're making him angry. Good, she snapped. Let him be angry. Let him show this town who he really is. From the darkness came the sound of a rifle being cocked. When Hayes spoke again, his cultured voice had gained a razor's edge. You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Morrison. No, Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. You are. You've been playing it for 3 years, and now it's time to finish it. She could see Jacob in her peripheral vision, his hand hovering over his gun. 3 years of running, 3 years of silence, and now the moment of truth had arrived. Clara thought about the dance they'd shared in her imagination, the conversations cut short by fear, the children they'd never discussed because he believed himself unworthy of happiness. Jacob, she said softly, it's time. He looked at her, and Clara saw the exact moment when he made his choice. The fear didn't leave his eyes, but it was joined by something else, determination, love, and the quiet courage of a man who'd finally decided to stop running. Jacob Crow-Feather stepped into the doorway, his hand resting easy on his gun. But, Hayes, he called into the darkness, you want to finish this? Let's finish it. That's more like it, came the reply. Step outside, hands where I can see them. No. Jacob's voice carried across the street, like thunder before lightning. You want me. You come and take me. But you leave my wife out of this. Clara felt her heart swell with fierce pride. This was the man she'd married, the one who'd been hiding behind walls of silence and fear. This was Jacob Crow-Feather, who'd loved 2 women enough to die for them. You're not in a position to make demands, Hayes called back. Maybe not, Jacob said, but I'm in a position to make sure you don't walk away from this. I've got nothing left to lose, Hayes. Nothing except her, and I'd rather die fighting than live running. Clara saw movement in the shadows across the street, men positioning themselves for the final assault. Hayes had grown tired of talking, tired of games. This would end in blood, one way or another. Jacob, she said quietly. He turned to look at her, and Clara saw everything in his eyes. 3 years of guilt, 6 months of love, and the terrible knowledge that this moment had always been coming. She leaned close, close enough that her lips brushed his ear, close enough that her words were for him alone. I love you too, she whispered. The first shot came from across the street, splintering wood beside Jacob's head. He dove sideways, pulling Clara down with him, as the night exploded in gunfire and shouting. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly flowers, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air thick as smoke. Jacob rolled behind the overturned table, his pistol finally clear of leather. Stay down, he shouted over the chaos. Whatever happens, stay down. But Clara was already moving, her rifle finding its target through the broken window. She'd been her father's daughter long before she'd been Jacob's wife, and pioneers didn't survive by hiding when trouble came calling. The battle for Millbrook had begun, and for the first time in 3 years, Jacob Crow-Feather had something worth fighting for. In the midst of the gunfire and chaos, as bullets shattered what remained of their quiet life, Jacob looked at his wife and finally found the words he'd been saving for 6 months. I love you, he said, his voice carrying over the thunder of rifles and the shouts of dying men. Clara smiled, her finger steady on the trigger, her heart full of words they'd finally learned to speak. I know, she said, and squeezed off a shot that sent Captain Hayes diving for cover behind his horse. The silence was finally broken. Now they'd see if love was bulletproof.